In the desert beyond Socorro, the controller first noticed the vanishing of the background. The airwaves turned flat, like scorched tape. No echoes of lightning, no distant aircraft trails, only a hollow silence, as if someone had cut a piece of the world and left emptiness in its place. In the spring of 1994, the air traffic control zone of Albuquerque Center held above the desert a stretch of sky that felt more precise than expected. Radio beacons transmitted steadily. Winds followed predictable cycles. Yet between 14 and 18,000 feet during the night shifts, the familiar traces disappeared. There were no faint echoes from distant aircraft, no drifting scatter of atmospheric grain, no trembling threads from storms beyond the horizon. The reports used the word quiet, intending to describe stable connections, but the silence that emerged was greater than the instruments were designed to deliver. West of Socorro, where the brown hills offered landmarks with sharp edges on official charts, the absence of background noise settled like a misprint. Sometimes it lasted only a few minutes, sometimes a full quarter hour. The magnetic tape that recorded routine transmissions rolled forward without the expected bursts, each line clean, as though the excess had been cut away. Adjustments to attenuators changed nothing. The technicians drafted an internal term for it, a phrase detached from ordinary meteorology. The dry corridor, a stretch where noise dissolved completely. At the boundary of that corridor, a man worked who trusted only in measurements. He was assigned to maintain the old meteorological sensors by Interstate 25, a scattering of aluminum towers and weatherproof boxes tethered to the dust. On several nights he observed how the suspended ruler, a strip of metal meant to catch subtle gusts, hung still even when midnight winds should have swayed it. Instruments showed humidity within normal ranges, pressure steady, yet sounds clipped themselves short, each one cut off a fraction sooner than nature allowed. One morning, he found the sharp imprint of a coyote's paw in the powder near the shelter. The edges were crisp, every claw mark exact. A week later he returned and saw the same print still clear, unchanged, as if the desert air had never touched it. Wind had swept the highway shoulders, but within the silent perimeter the dust remained untroubled. No one at the time searched for a reason. The controllers kept to schedules. The traffic lanes flowed above 20,000 feet, and no delays were logged. The quiet appeared only in the background, a subtraction too subtle for urgency. Reports held their columns of numbers. Night protocols stayed even, and the silence was accepted as a kind of background state, as though the desert had withdrawn one layer of its voice. In July of 1995, the heat held the desert in a fixed haze, pressing against windshields and asphalt until both shimmered like metal left in a furnace. Long-haul drivers passed through Arizona with half-open windows, letting air in that carried no relief, only the dry smell of scorched sand and rubber. At a truck stop near Winslow, the neon signs that usually flickered in pale pinks and greens were dark that month, the owner having removed the transformer for replacement. Without the glow, the parking lot was bare, and the usual hum of highway noise drifted in clearer, stripped of its distractions. Engines cooled one by one, ticking softly, and the drivers marked their mileage in notebooks by flashlight. The sound of graphite scratching paper was louder than expected. The absence of neon made the sky feel wider, the desert heavier, and the road strangely hollow. It was in this stillness that a light appeared over the eastern horizon. It was not the broken pulse of a beacon or the flicker of distant aircraft. It shone in a way that was constant, a fixed lamp pressed against the void, without sparkle or shadow. The light advanced slowly, changing altitude without shifting its angle, swelling larger and then dimming, before brightening again as if nothing had intervened. Drivers who noticed it stood in silence by their cabs, though no one raised a hand or pointed. The air pressed down hard, the lot smelled of diesel, and the light expanded in its own rhythm, indifferent to attention. In the Navajo County logs, later opened and read by clerks in a windowless office, a few neat sentences recorded that night, as a luminous phenomenon with no characteristics of an aircraft. CB radios on Channel 13 cut off conversations an instant before the light grew more intense above the horizon. The recordings of those channels were plain magnetic cassettes, spools marked with fingerprints, yet the moment was the same on each one. A smooth band of noise reduction stretched across the tape, like silence pressed into plastic, as if all drivers had stopped speaking at the exact second. When they resumed, their voices carried no trace of awareness, as though nothing had been interrupted. The uniformity unsettled the few who listened to the tapes afterward, though the official note was mild. Communications stable. By the morning traffic bulletin, the event had already been softened into one line, a short item beneath updates on construction delays and lane closures. The phrase read, "Unidentified source of light, no disruption to movement reported." The brevity kept it from standing out, yet to those who remembered the night, the words felt misplaced. The horizon had held more than a harmless light. It had carried an absence that stretched into the body, a pause that could not be timed. Further west, past Flagstaff, a ranger on night duty watched over the pines. He made notes by lantern, but what he noticed most was what he did not hear. The forest carried no rummaging near the garbage bins, no scratch of raccoons tipping lids, no shuffle of skunks or deer on the gravel road. Waste containers remained untouched, the plastic bags smooth and upright at dawn. On the watchtower, where the beams usually cooled with tiny cracks and pops, not one sound arrived. The air around the wood stayed fixed, as though the tower had been sealed in glass. He looked down toward the base of the ridge where a single tent stood in the clearing. The fabric held its lines sharply, unstirred, as if the weight of its own folds could not press inward. He wrote nothing about it in his log, leaving the page blank until morning. The stillness stretched through the county like an overlay, a second layer of reality folding over the first. By the end of the month, the regional office sent out a memorandum. The phrasing was plain, bureaucratic. All staff were to report any malfunctions of household or service equipment observed during nocturnal hours. The circular reached stores, barbershops, ranger stations, and substations. Replies came back thin, not alarming, but oddly consistent. In Holbrook, cash registers read barcodes on the first attempt without pause, an efficiency described as unexpectedly precise. In a barbershop, an old radio that had hissed with static for years maintained a steady whisper for nearly an hour without fluctuation. At the Snowflake Power substation, workers observed a line reading that fell below its usual static level. The hum of transformers smoothed into a tone almost musical, like a chord held without tremor. They wrote the word "even" into the protocol notes, a detail small enough to vanish among numbers, yet significant enough that each man remembered it when the form was filed away. The corridor of silence spread in pieces, never recorded as a whole. Each observer saw only a fragment: a driver watching a horizon lamp, a ranger marking a forest without sounds, a technician reading a stable line. None of them had reason to connect the fragments. None of them were asked to. The records, sparse and factual, built a surface of normalcy that concealed the deep subtraction underneath. In that summer, the road itself seemed to travel without friction, as though the country between Winslow and Flagstaff had been placed in suspension, held apart from its own noise. The months that followed drew no further comments, yet for those who worked the nights of July 1995, a memory remained, not sharp, but lingering like a trace of heat after flame. They recalled that trucks cooled without echo, forests stood without a breath, and radios shaped their silence into uniform strips. They recalled that the horizon glowed once with a steady lamp, and though it carried no threat, it carried something more lasting, the sense that sound itself had been withdrawn and the highway had moved forward with no voice. In the spring of 1997, the desert south of Bingham lay in a haze of pale sand and metal silence. On a restricted testing ground, where chain-link fences rattled against dry wind and signs warned of penalties for trespass, an old radio pavilion stood partly dismantled. Its walls carried peeling paint, and the air inside carried the faint odor of dust burned by sun-heated aluminum. The pavilion was filled with remnants of another decade. Oscilloscopes with green phosphor screens, boxy power supplies, and square telephones with hard plastic buttons. These objects were lined in rows as though they had been retired from service but not discarded, waiting for functions no longer clear. Amid this collection of instruments, a temporary station had been set up, its tables arranged with cables, dials, and prototype filters designed to suppress interference. The setting was both archaic and experimental, a place where old steel cabinets hummed faintly while new wires stretched in deliberate tension across the floor. At 3 o'clock one night, the equipment was brought to life. The frequency chosen was 27.12 MHz, a number marked in the schedules as standard but unremarkable. When signals were first launched, the operators expected random hiss, the restless fog of the spectrum. Instead, what emerged was a flat absence, a rectangular cut in the band, as though something had been pulled away not only from the signal, but from the space between its grains. The oscilloscopes displayed no violent peaks, no overload. The band appeared carved with precision, smooth and symmetrical, like a corridor cut out of air. The experiment continued with small adjustments. Levels were changed by increments, dials turned with steady hands. The antenna was lowered to the ground and then raised onto a mast, each movement marked in logs with blue ink. The magnetic tape recorder turned with mechanical patience, its reels ticking with regular motion. On playback, the tape displayed long gray stretches, uniform in density, with no rhythm of variation. In a separate enclosure, another device produced spectrum charts onto a creeping strip of tractor-fed paper. Line after line emerged without gaps, yet each graph revealed the same void. A pale band without structure, perfectly even, refusing to explain itself. The phenomenon carried on for hours, leaving operators shifting in their seats, pencils tapping against clipboards without notes to anchor them. No instrument displayed stress or fault. It was as though the absence had been imposed beforehand, arranged in advance of the experiment, indifferent to settings or adjustments. Silence appeared not as a lack of effort, but as a delivered fact, a layer placed into the fabric of the air itself. During those same weeks, across 3 counties of New Mexico, fields revealed changes more physical. Irrigation systems rotated in their familiar arcs, water spraying across wheat and alfalfa. Yet plants at the outer rims of the circles bore leaves that looked altered. The edges carried a peculiar brightness, as though pressed beneath a constant light that had erased their shadows. The leaves were not burned or dried. Instead, they appeared stripped of depth, as if a dimension had been pared away. Farmers took Polaroid photographs, holding them in calloused hands while the images resolved. The photographs showed patches without microtexture, planes of brightness that seemed untouched by dust or relief. On film prints, the grain emerged normally, but when capturing those particular plots, the grain refused to attach itself, leaving expanses of unnatural smoothness. By the summer, reports grew more numerous, spreading from farms to small towns near the hills. At night, residents described moving lights above ridgelines. The lights did not pulse or flicker. They advanced with unbroken steadiness, maintaining a single pace without rise or fall. The absence of acceleration unsettled witnesses, as each span of distance between landmarks was covered with identical timing. Some wrote that their footsteps on gravel seemed to lag behind, as though sound itself had lost its anchor. Battery-driven clocks ticked on in correct sequence, their hands marking minutes without hesitation. Yet on camcorder recordings, the motions of people looked thickened, more saturated than natural. Flames from campfires writhed and bent, but their dance did not cast shadows. They consumed without displacement, as if light had withdrawn from its own duty. The language of official papers remained guarded, Reports from the state's offices noted observed aerial illumination without acoustic signature and environmental anomalies under review. Staff were instructed to avoid descriptive flourishes, to remove anything that hinted at judgment. Internal memos circulated with emphasis on neutrality, as if restraint itself were a defense. From the Council of Socorro, a typed sheet was dispatched, carrying one question to the laboratory: whether natural phenomena existed that could reduce background noise across a wide band. The inquiry bore no urgency, only an even spacing of letters on government paper. The reply arrived with equal caution. The phrase explained that atmospheric inversion could diminish distant echoes, yet it could not increase the intensity of silence. The words held the tone of weather discussion, a small matter of air currents, as though the absence of sound belonged only to climate. Within the testing pavilion, the equipment was powered down at dawn. The antennas stood against a pale horizon, their shadows shortened by a rising sun. Reels were stacked in metal cases, charts folded into drawers. The room filled once more with the dormant hum of obsolete devices. Yet each operator carried a residue of the night, a recognition that what they had recorded was not simply signal or absence, but a reshaping of the medium itself. The desert, wide and indifferent, contained within its silence a band that resisted explanation, a corridor hollowed from the spectrum that endured without name. In the winter of 1998, the desert around the abandoned salt spur lay in a silence that seemed heavier than air. The rains had not come that year, and the ground cracked into shallow tessellations that echoed underfoot. When the spring semester began, a group of college volunteers from a nearby campus was granted access to the derelict radio station standing by the freight tracks. The building rose with low geometry, concrete walls without ornament, its doors rusted on hinges that creaked with minimal resistance. Wind carried fine powder through the open seams, layering the floor with pale sediment. Yet inside, the air seemed too still, as if currents avoided the interior deliberately. The volunteers moved through the entry hall into what had once been a control room. Most of the equipment had long been removed, leaving only outlines on the tables where once devices had stood. The surfaces were coated with dust except for precise rectangles, darker in tone, the clean shadows of absent instruments. Those shapes appeared preserved as if objects had only just been lifted, leaving imprints untouched by time. Along one wall, the tables bore symmetrical gaps, each the size of standard radio blocks, arranged with machine-like spacing. In the far corner, there existed a zone that drew particular attention, an area without dust, without scratches, as if a hand had wiped it recently, though no one had entered for years. The patch resisted explanation, its clarity unnatural, as if the surface had never participated in the same chronology as the rest of the room. On the floor near this corner lay a glass fuse. Its tube was transparent, the metal caps at each end intact, yet the filament inside carried no ordinary state. Under magnification, the wire was neither broken nor whole. It resembled an image blurred beyond recognition, a strip that had lost the attribute of sharpness itself. Where metal should have been crystalline, the segment dissolved into uncertainty. The volunteers tested it with a multimeter, placing the probes on the caps. The instrument needle quivered in contradiction, indicating 0 and infinity at once, oscillating in indecision as though caught between poles of reality. The students repeated the test several times, but each attempt produced the same restless drift. The fuse became an object that defied category, neither operational nor failed, suspended in an impossible interval. Against the back wall stood a bookshelf, its wood bowed by years of dry air. Inside were journals whose spines cracked as they were opened. The pages held printed charts, hand-drawn annotations, and sequences of pencil markings. Between two volumes rested a loose sheet bearing a series of coordinates, pairs of timestamps, and measured levels inscribed in careful handwriting. Each level was identical, without fluctuation, each row a repetition of the previous. At the bottom of the sheet, a brief note had been written in small script. Background stable, unnatural. The words ended abruptly halfway down the line, as though interrupted by silence rather than by any physical hand. The sheet carried no creases, no signs of haste, only the sudden cessation of record. In adjoining rooms, the absence persisted. Old racks stood empty, but their bolts carried the memory of weight. On the walls, discolorations outlined where panels had once been mounted. The building spoke in negative, presenting only the impressions of instruments rather than the instruments themselves. Where switches had been installed, the walls now bore pale rectangles with darker edges. Cables cut flush with the plaster protruded like veins sealed off without wound. The students documented these with disposable cameras, but when prints returned, they showed peculiar uniformity in tone, as if contrast had been moderated by an invisible hand. The edges of shadows blurred, producing an image that resisted the grain of film. Outside the facility, the desert reflected the same silence. Metal poles that once carried wires leaned slightly toward the horizon, their insulators cracked but unfallen. The ground beneath the structure was free of debris, curiously clean, as though swept by an unseen maintenance. Tracks leading up to the spur had rusted, yet the ballast stones between the ties retained an odd symmetry, aligned too neatly for abandonment. The group lingered in observation, uncertain if they were studying a relic of human construction or the residue of another agency entirely. During that same spring, local fire service inspections revealed anomalies of their own. Fire extinguishers, tested according to schedule, functioned yet behaved in unexpected ways. When triggered, the cylinders released their contents in steady jets, but the accompanying roar was diminished. The sound emerged muted, as though smothered before reaching the ear. Observers noted that the foam spread across surfaces with unusual uniformity. Instead of the porous texture expected from chemical bubbles, the substance appeared smooth, layering without fracture, as if microscopic irregularities had been erased. The foam coated metal and wood alike in flat sheets, reflecting light without sparkle. Inspectors recorded the events formally, assigning them to maintenance logs under the category "No apparent cause, device operational." The phrasing remained cautious, acknowledging anomaly without admitting it. The volunteers returned several times to the radio point, cataloging what they found. Each visit confirmed the persistence of the voids, the uncollected dust, the inanimate silence. They noted that inside the building their voices seemed smaller, falling back into their throats. When they struck metal surfaces with their knuckles, the sound registered less sharply than expected, as if resonance had been removed. Clocks carried into the structure kept accurate time, yet the passage of minutes felt stretched, their intervals drained of motion. Photographs accumulated, yet none carried the weight of explanation. The House of Silent Instruments resisted narrative, holding itself as an enclosure where function had ceased, but presence had not. By the end of spring, the group submitted their findings in a report written with restraint. The document emphasized physical details: the dustless corner, the anomalous fuse, the sheet of repeated levels, the extinguishers with muted discharge. The tone avoided speculation, presenting facts without conjecture. Yet beneath the surface, the implication remained that the building itself had become an instrument, no longer broadcasting signals but preserving their absence, a structure tuned to silence. The desert pressed in on all sides, hot and dry, but within those walls the air stayed still, charged with the memory of machinery that no longer existed. In the winter of 2000, the desert air carried a brittle clarity, as if each particle of dust had been combed into place by the long absence of rain. The transition into that year coincided with a small project in the basement of a municipal library in eastern Arizona. The basement, long unused except for storage of broken chairs and obsolete tape players, had been given to a group of volunteers cataloging an audio archive assembled in the 1970s. The collection was known unofficially as the sleep tapes, a set of recordings made for late-night radio broadcasts and experimental sound libraries. Hundreds of reels sat in cardboard boxes, their labels faded, ink reduced to ghosts of letters. The volunteers arranged them on shelves, spindles clicking softly as reels were mounted for listening. From the beginning, there was something uniform about the tapes. They were supposed to carry a mix of lullabies, atmospheric recordings, and readings, but what played back on many reels was silence thicker than absence. The tape moved, the heads engaged, yet what emerged from the speakers was not blank hiss. It was a dense quiet, a silence with weight. Between stretches of this stillness came irregular fragments, the hiss of wind without direction, a hum truncated before it became tone, a half-syllable falling into nothing. The students noted the recurrence of identical 8-second gaps across unrelated reels. Each gap carried the same contour, as if recorded from the same void. They began logging anomalies in ledgers, writing times and durations with pencil, aligning columns as neatly as possible. By the end of the first week, their notes filled several pages with repeating intervals. The same patterns emerged regardless of which box was chosen. When synchronized side by side, the tapes produced silence in alignment, a phenomenon too precise to be accident. The reels were old, their magnetic layers flaking, yet the distortions were not random decay. They carried form, symmetry, and recurrence. In the following months, listeners from other towns contributed their own archives. Some brought cassettes of late-night broadcasts captured during the 1980s, recordings meant to preserve music or roadside chatter. On these cassettes, similar gaps appeared, stretches where suppression seemed universal. Truck drivers' conversations on citizen band radios dropped into still intervals, as if voices had been paused in mid-sentence. On playback, the silences aligned to the same rhythm as those discovered in the basement. The volunteers compared the cassettes against the reels, layering them in waveform displays, and saw the cuts converge. The impression grew that the silence itself had been broadcast deliberately, folded into transmission. During long nights of listening, the group noticed subjective effects. Time seemed to shift subtly while a reel played. An hour's session could feel shortened, yet when the clocks were checked, minutes had extended beyond expectation. Journals kept by the listeners carried entries where perception fractured. Moments where the switch of a tape occurred too early or later than possible. Some described the sensation of falling behind one's own thoughts, as if memory refused to attach to its proper sequence. The experiences resembled those described months earlier by drivers near Highway 60, but here they occurred indoors, seated at wooden desks, with reels spinning under fluorescent light. Equipment used for monitoring produced further anomalies. On voltage meters connected to the reel motors, needles drifted into unstable ranges. They climbed by steps rather than smooth arcs, pausing at exact marks before jumping again. Oscilloscopes wired to auxiliary outputs drew clean rectangles where noise should have scattered. At times, the trace line froze entirely, holding straight as if recording a geometric figure rather than a signal. Photocopies of these outputs showed pages where entire sections lacked deviation, empty yet deliberate. Word of the project reached small offices of cultural preservation within the state. Officials visited to inspect the archive, carrying clipboards and conservative questions. They flipped through ledgers, examined cassettes, and wrote brief remarks such as possible damage to magnetic substrate and systematic artifact from duplication. They avoided speculative language, assigning each anomaly to benign technical explanations. Yet their faces betrayed caution, and their presence carried an unspoken instruction. Continue cataloging, but refrain from interpretation. Beyond the basement, other patterns appeared. Residents reported nights when radios slipped into sudden muting. On certain frequencies, entire segments of local talk vanished, replaced by the dense silence recognizable from the archive. Portable recorders captured these events. When the tapes were brought into the basement and aligned against older reels, the gaps matched perfectly, as though separated decades had folded into one continuity. The volunteers adopted the name Phono Archive of Sleep not as official title, but as a way of explaining what they heard. The phrase suggested both dreams and recordings, a memory preserved beyond memory. They stored the reels in metal cabinets, labeling boxes with dates and short descriptions. Uniform void, 8-second gap, sequence without variance. The act of labeling gave a sense of control, yet each new reel resisted containment. The silence continued to arrive with structure intact, unweakened by years. By the end of that year, the archive held more than 100 documented cases. The library basement grew dense with shelves and tables, yet the room itself seemed to inherit the properties of the tapes. Sound carried differently there. Footsteps softened, pages turned without crispness, and pencils struck paper with muted impact. Visitors noticed that their own breathing sounded delayed, entering their ears with the same stepwise rhythm recorded on meters. Some avoided long stays, claiming fatigue after brief listening. Reports reached the regional administration again. Notes circulated that referred to multiple accounts of temporally limited phenomena and recommended avoidance of speculative linkage. Language echoed earlier memoranda from 1999, cautious and repetitive. The phrases advised against creating terminology, against unifying scattered incidents. Each line carried the implicit directive: do not escalate. The basement remained active, reels turning steadily. Students rotated through shifts, listening, recording, documenting. Each silence was logged, each void measured. The Phono Archive grew into a mirror, reflecting not only the history of broadcasts, but a persistent interruption stretching across time. The tapes did not answer. They only held their silences, repeating them faithfully, offering nothing but their weight. And so the project continued, layer upon layer of absence, preserved with the precision of fact, as if sleep itself had chosen to leave behind a record carved into magnetic dust. In the autumn of that year, the enthusiasts gathered everything that could be collected without permits. Boxes filled with tapes where signals had been absent, photographs of fields without shadows, meteorological bulletins with repeating lines, and journals with identical figures were stacked and labeled. On the cover of one cassette, written in the faded ink of an old marker, someone had left the words, "The Night Without Whisper." When attempts were made to overlay the data, a rhythm appeared. It was not calendar-based, nor linked to weather cycles, but closer to something musical. The absences did not fall on identical nights, yet they aligned along similar angles as though guided by a hidden structure. Each form resembled a precise cut, without edges or ornaments, only disappearance. When translated into spectrographic charts, the recordings stretched smooth and blank like untouched paper. Yet to the ear they carried a faint signature, a subtle tone, as if silence itself held a recognizable shade. The technician, who had once lived at the edge of the dry corridor, revisited his notebooks. Over the year, the dust had settled in even layers, not everywhere, but in repeating strips. The page marked with the single word "even" remained the last entry. The coyote's print by the shelter had faded until it blended into the surface, indistinguishable from the soil. At the place where the fuse had once lost sharpness, there was nothing left to observe. No glass, no metal, only the neutral odor of a room emptied of detail. In the State Service Archives, the folder marked "Citizen Inquiries About Nightlights" eventually received a new label: "Closed due to absence of threat." Inside remained short replies written with the restraint of bureaucracy, not confirmed by radar, possibly astronomical, no risk to navigation. On the cardboard cover, a handprint lingered, faint and permanent, a mark that neither brightened nor darkened under changing lamps, fixed in its neutrality. By the decade's end, a name was quietly suggested. In a local paper, a small column appeared describing the even nights of the desert. It carried no dramatic claims, no attempt at definition, only a sequence of muted instruments, aligned tapes, and lines of light without sound. Readers turned the page, folded the paper, and nothing outwardly changed. The desert remained the same. Highways stretched to horizons. The screens of the control centers displayed routes with unbroken precision. At times a glow rose again above a distant ridge, neither inviting nor repelling, tracing its line across air that seemed not its own. The roads kept their records, stacking reports, tapes, and observations. Among the words repeated most often, one surfaced again and again: even. It was left in the margins, in the ledgers, in the summaries, the single descriptor that outlasted all others. When someone stopped at night along a shoulder, cut the engine, and listened, the desert offered no stories in return. It only enacted what it had enacted in those years, a silence shaped carefully, surplus, and without borders. People drifted into sleep more easily than in their own homes. Magnetic spools inside their minds unrolled more gently, without friction. And when they woke again, it seemed to them that somewhere in the half-light a trace remained, not of footsteps, not of vehicles, but of the air itself, which once had managed to cross an entire night without whisper.